Give it up for Paul.
Cool. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you guys so much for having me. I know when I was transitioning into full-time engineering, gosh, it must be 7 years now ago, the community here really was invaluable for connecting me with people and offering lots of good ideas and support. It's also really cool to see Moshe speak today. He was the one that encouraged me to give my first conference talk, and it's just been really cool to be on the same bill, and hopefully this will be interesting to you guys. And if it's not, I'll leave my email address. You can send me hate mail. So I could, because I work at an SEC registered company. Disclaimers. Okay, you saw that. Great. So we'll go over contents-wise. I'm going to try to set the scene of like, hey, why is quality a problem, and what sort of things do we work on where all the rest of this and the exploration of LLMs came to pass. We'll talk a little bit about production probes, which some of my former Adapar colleagues here are probably aware of, and how that led us into starting to play with ChatGPT and LLMs in the realm of testing. And we'll talk about some areas where it's actually been pretty effective for us. And finally talk about using LLMs in a project I called Irulan to try to assess our functional test coverage with Playwright tests, which I thought was pretty interesting. It's certainly something I'm really interested in expanding. And if I talk fast enough, we can talk about living documentation and behavior-driven development, which has always been something I've been fascinated by since I saw how Cucumber tests work back in the Rails days. And I think LLMs provide a really interesting springboard and address some of the technical challenges that people had with Cucumber and some of those other approaches. So this is the requisite I am not a robot all the time slide. Also shows that at one point in time I didn't realize I don't have enough hair and I need to cut it all off. This is the family that keeps me sane. My son Milo is an aspiring video game designer, and he drew a little Python when he found out I was giving this talk, so I wanted to put it up here. And my wife Jamie was the world women's Quake champion, I learned after we started dating a while. And I was like, dude, you gotta lead with that. Like, that's pretty cool. You're a pro gamer. So she's far more interesting than I am, but anyway, they're the wind in my sails, and they've been super supportive, and I'm glad she is taking care of that whole mess while I'm out here with you guys tonight. By way of trying to explain that I have some degree of value to impart here, I was dropped out of a PhD program in organic chemistry and a programming autodidact, I guess is the term, but I was at the Climate Corporation, which was one of the original software unicorns. I made the product that they wound up selling to Monsanto 10 years ago, I believe last week, which is kind of crazy to date myself. I've been in the Silicon Valley startup scene for almost, somewhere between 15 and 20 years. I don't care to count exactly where that was. But yeah, it's been crazy to see Dave Friedberg on the podcast a bunch. I was at Adapar afterwards. That's where I made my transition to engineering full time, and got to work with this lovely Kevin Fong right here. As a result of that, I worked on our security program when we started getting into the enterprises primarily, and became a QA director somewhat by happenstance. And it was very interesting to me to look at these two worlds that treated these classes of bugs or problems as though they were completely separate things, right? So security bugs or problems within a compliance process that might involve humans were treated somehow as being segregated away from this other class of application bugs. When I realized there are a lot of techniques that could be used in both cases, there's a lot of cross-pollination that could have happened that just wasn't. So I've been very much fascinated by quality control, even though my life right now exists mostly in the security space, if you were wondering why a CISO does a quality talk. More recently was at Primer. We did NLP, NLG, I guess they call it generative AI for government, military intelligence type clients. Got to be the first security software engineer there. And now I am the CISO and do some engineering work at Opto. I'll try to blaze through this really quick, but Opto is tackling this problem of private markets. So public markets where you trade stocks and bonds. Private markets are things like private equity, hedge funds, and venture capital. There's a ton of money, so $12 trillion of invested capital in it. And a lot of the deals that are done here are done like it's legal insider trading. It's pretty incredible. Like it's very much back office, who you know, paper. If you're getting good, maybe it's PDFs being passed around. It's incredibly inefficient, and it also it's opaque. It benefits the people that are already in it, and it's also not leading to the kind of social outcomes that we want, from directing capital to projects that are going to provide a return on capital. Or if you think that venture capital, for example, should be leading to companies that are building the future, it seems like it would be a lot better to invest in the venture capital firms and those companies that are actually doing that, or that are aligned with your values, than the one that you just happen to be able to get to pick the phone up for you because you're a little fish. So it's a really, really interesting space, and we think we can use technology and humans together in an interesting way. We say it's a marriage of Silicon Valley engineers and sort of New York investment prowess. This is what Midjourney came up there. I think it's pretty funny, both that Silicon Valley engineering is like wearing a C-3PO dress, and also there's like a weird protuberance up on that building there, but that's sort of what we do. I'm gonna jet through this fairly quickly. There's a lot of the world that I wind up covering as part of the sort of the investment firms, and again, we're registered with the SEC, so we've got a ton of stuff to deal with there. We're gonna focus reductively on a part of our software application that really is, you can imagine, like a software marketplace that has a variety of data analysis tools incorporated in it, and it's a Next.js app, and started as Java Swing. We're migrating it to Python FastAPI in order to do analysis on those tools. I also wanted to highlight we do a ton of work because this is this big esoteric, archaic problem, lots of counterparties, lots of other people were interacting in these systems to do these kinds of transactions, figure out tax and legal implications, et cetera. So we have to do quite a bit of testing to make sure that, if one of these parties delivers incorrect information or fails, that we're able to fail gracefully or recover from that. So quality is super, super important here. I'm gonna speed through this a little bit. There we go. Let's talk about production probes, sort of how we came to this. Production probes, the idea is, I borrowed it from Netflix way back in the Adapar days. You run a bunch of these lightweight tests constantly, every 5 to 15 minutes, let's say, to check that P0 functionality and like configuration is working. The idea being that you're constantly driving load at your application, and you can respond really quickly if there's a problem. And so that was one of the first things I did when I got to Opto. This also is really helpful in our realm because it's not like a VC firm that people want to engage with shows up every day. We're talking about users that might be engaging on a monthly or quarterly basis. We want to make sure that when they operate the software that's configured for them, that everything works properly. So you can't rely, like in a B2C business, on natural traffic producing errors that you can go after. So we're producing load on our system. We can always back it off if there's too much traffic. And we can also look at errors or oddities in terms of the logging that's coming out the other end, because we're touching everything, right? So that's been a pretty effective tool. This is, incidentally, when you feed this in the Midjourney, this is Smoko the clown. We call him the smoke tester. That's what it thinks a smoke tester looks like, as a clown. Here's an example. Rats is kind of hard to read, but you can see it's very, very naive. I'm basically, I have a dictionary of errors. I'm making a bunch of GET or POST requests, and then I'm adding the results to that dictionary, and we go through and look at it. This is like one of these things that's born out of necessity because I didn't want to get paged, right? This is what a production probe looks like. Super, super basic. Okay, well, that's always annoyed me. But I had this moment where some of the other developers, particularly front-end developers, started adding to this project, which always makes one super, super happy. And I started to ask, well, why? And also, why are you writing Python when I think that you're pretty fluent in JavaScript and TypeScript? How do we do this? And it turns out they were taking code snippets that I had and sometimes writing some stuff in TypeScript with it and feeding it into ChatGPT. And it was spitting out smoke tests that mostly worked or basically worked and could be tweaked ever so slightly. And this was kind of mind-blowing to me, right? Like, okay, first off, awesome that they're using it. And secondly, like, this seems like it might be an opportunity to get people to be able to play in different parts of the system and fairly fluently write tests or like lower the barrier to entry for some of these tests. And I think the mental model I developed here is, LLMs are like translation machines, right? Or I'll mention this later, but they're like very inexperienced but enthusiastic interns. So for a translation machine example, one of the things I knew with this is like, hey, writing your own test runner is a really bad idea, and it was lazy, and I shouldn't have done it probably, but I did it. Can I just make this into PyTest by dropping it into ChatGPT, and lo and behold, it works, which was kind of amazing to me, right? So it allowed me to start doing things that I knew I was supposed to be doing without having to spend too much effort on it, which was the reason I wasn't doing it in the first place, right? And so here's a laundry list of things that we found these GPT models and LLMs in general to be good at doing. And again, this needs to all be caveated with, it's like an enthusiastic intern. This is like what you would do if you went to the documentation and started copying and pasting pieces out. You have to test it, you're gonna find bugs, you're gonna find things that were done incorrectly, but it definitely can give you active ideas about how to approach things. So I mentioned rearranging your Python code into reasonable structures. I've had it move, for example, code that I've written in a functional style to an object-oriented style and back again. Bash is a fantastic place as an entry point. So some of the folks that we have looked at these massive, beautiful one-liners that I or someone else has written, and then they've translated it into a language that they are much more fluent in, or they've just asked to have a bash command written for something that they need to have done, and it actually works a reasonable amount of the time. It's specifically crushes at Kubernetes. So not just giving you the right commands, but also doing some degree of explanation, even fairly complex explanation about why Kubernetes isn't doing what I thought it was doing, or why Kubernetes did the thing this way and not some other way. I think it's because the documentation is so good that it just feels very fluid, so that's been awesome. There are a couple of tools that you can use, and you can use ChatGPT as well, but like Codium AI and Sapient AI will give you a list of suggestions for your code of unit tests that you might want to write. And oftentimes, yes, they are naive unit tests, but I find, at least when I write code, that writing unit tests is not the first thing that I jump to. So getting a bunch of suggestions where I'm like, yeah, I want this one, this one, this one, and maybe I'm going to tweak something because it fucked it up, that's maybe really worth the time of using a plugin like that. I will mention I don't use it day to day, but I do know people that do. Yeah. It's really, really interesting how, even if you don't use it, it starts to make you think about how might this function break, or what edge cases am I not considering that I need to be considering. And I'll show you in a sec, it writes infrastructure tests. We actually test our deployment pipelines, the functionality within them in code pipeline, and the lambdas there. I've always said I wanted to do that, and I've never actually done it. And one of our devs, I'll show you in a sec, just went and put up a PR that had a whole bunch of tests in it, and it took him like an afternoon because ChatGPT. This is an example I thought was pretty cool. Front-ender sent this over. I was trying to figure out the release tags for given commits to do some alerting, and I had to clone the entire repo of every repo we had every time in order to do it. He stuffed it into ChatGPT, and like lo and behold, he's got a bash one-liner that does it, and it's nicely formatted. You can see it's turned it in a multi-line. That's pretty sweet, right? It's something where it's like, hey, I feel like this could be better. Let's just see if it does it, and if it doesn't, that's a minute of my time. Who cares? Well, it turns out it worked. Great for low-hanging fruit. And then this is a real quick one. You can tell that it's probably written by ChatGPT because it's broken up nicely and has links to documentation, which is something I've never seen a real human do. But it's writing out mocks, and the person that put this together doesn't know how to mock in Python, right? And this all works, and this is now across pretty much our entire code pipeline repo. Okay, so the pièce de résistance, Playwright. And this is what led me to write this talk in the first place. So if you don't know what Playwright's a browser testing tool, kind of like Selenium or Cypress. I like it better than those, but it still has all the wonderful problems of browser testing, namely that they're flaky and they're slow, right? You're making a browser do a bunch of things, but you do get this like really nice end-to-end testing experience where you're touching the same stuff that you would pretty much as a user would. So when you use it if you use it intelligently, it's insanely powerful. And when you use it poorly, it's a complete waste of developer time, and it's slow as all get out. So we had a whole bunch of these tests written for a whole bunch of features, and we started running into this question of like, well, what kind of functional test coverage do we actually have? And that's not easy to figure out, right? You're looking through like 700 line or 7,000 line test files of stuff that's hypothetically human readable, but isn't necessarily. When it comes down to it, you have to understand TypeScript, and there's a lot of domain specificity because we're in a little niche-y part of finance, right? So this actually proved to be somewhat of a difficult challenge. So I'll show you, we have a lot of tests. It's not clear what they're testing, and it's not clear whether the trouble it takes to run said tests is worth the amount of time we're putting into them or compute we're putting into them, right? Here's a good example. One of the ones that I found, we were testing in one case that we were showing a loading state, and that was flaking on average 10 times a day, wasting about 300 minutes of developer time waiting for these tests to go and having the suite fail and having to start it all over again. And you can see I just skipped it, but why the hell are we testing a loading state? Like, who cares if it doesn't load? Like, that's not a good use of a browser-based test. So can I look through and find all these sorts of things? I didn't really know. So I developed this sort of a quick project. First step, you have to use AI like Midjourney to make a cool README image, which I'll show you in a second. Second step, you're going to iterate through all the test files with Python. It's FastAPI behind the scenes. You can see this is the prompt for ChatGPT, or rather the GPT 3.5 turbo model. It's very basic. It says like, hey, I have this Playwright test for a financial services application. Can you tell me what features I'm testing? Based on that, like, can you infer this? And then summarize what the test is testing, and then enumerate the steps that are being tested. Pretty bloody basic. We can talk after about some tuning and some other things you can do here. So I run this for every test. I write it to Markdown, and then I serve it up with this little guy here. It's using vanilla JavaScript and templated out with Jinja HTML, which I used ChatGPT to write, and it basically worked out of the box, right? And then I went through and looked for which tests don't match what I see on the page, or which tests are doing things that look kind of funky. And you do that over a huge repository or a rather large application, and that's an incredible efficiency gain. And I think there's a lot that we could jump off and do that's significantly more interesting. Again, that kind of BD, living documentation thing that I should have tried to work into here better. That's Irulan, who's the holder of Muad'Dib's history from Dune. I think Midjourney did a good job there. This is your list of massive tests that all lead to this markdown that got jammed out pretty quick. Here's an example of backing into functionality. I, of course, had to excise tons of this because finance, but you can see at the top, there's a bunch of verification that certain configurations are set up in place. Is that really something that we need to be verifying? That's a good question to be able to ask the people that wrote the feature or that understand the domain better. I'm going to place here, you can see I've had to pull out the specific value, but it says answer the question about total assets exceeding some dollar amount with yes. Why do we pick that dollar amount? Do we want to run a whole bunch of basically a sensitivity test or a data table test against the API directly? Do we care within the UI? What's going on there? Good question to ask. And there's a section where it says answer the questions about, and it gives this massive list of things. Many of them are acronyms. Well, one of the great things with here is you can ask it to spell out what all the acronyms mean, and it will do it very happily, and it will be about as accurate as if you went and Googled all of them. So we found that to be a pretty significant lift when you're trying to understand like what the hell is this thing doing. And you can see this wound up being like hundreds of lines of description of what's going on here. And you can go through and then match the two together, and it's pretty powerful. So there's some next steps and things we've been playing with. I mentioned the acronyms. You can also include sort of common domain-based phrases or language that can be injected into the prompt, or you can use one of the, you don't have to send it out to OpenAI. You can use something that's local based. Olama has been awesome for that. We can compare all of this to what the documentation we have, or specs, requirements docs, tickets, et cetera. That can be done actually directly, where you're pulling together all the information that you might have about a feature, so you can look at it all in one place and make assessments about how testing ought to be done. We potentially can pull in or use heuristics or rules to try to decide which tests might be good candidates for replacement as unit tests or integration tests. Or in the case of the loading states, like, hey, go through and just turn off all the loading or delete all the loading state code. Like, this is crap, right? This doesn't need to be here. That can be done through a rule. And finally, there's a whole bunch of BDD and living documentation stuff that would be super interesting to dig into. And if you guys corner me later, or I can do another talk, there's so much cool stuff that's happening there. And I've got some examples if I have not run out of time. I wanted to thank some people. A lot of the interesting stuff was work from my colleagues or work with my colleagues. Mike Phillips and Ruben Jimenez are two that did a whole ton of this. Colton Evans, Greg Fong, and Matt Reed also quite a bit. That's an Optonaut, which is our spirit animal of sorts at Opto. Also came out of Midjourney. I've got a nice sticker here too. And yes, I think I'm probably out of time, but that's my email address. Happy to talk about anything, send you slides. I will talk your absolute ears off about this. Oh, I've got 5 minutes. Oh, that's trouble, because I'm going to show you more stuff. And then that's our website. But I'm pk@optoinvest.com. Ping me. That's a whole bunch of fun stuff my son and I came up with from Midjourney. Okay, let me show you something fun from BDD, right? So if you guys remember BDD, behavior-driven development, the idea was that you could use like plain English or human-readable specifications to define the behavior of your system, which is incredibly appealing. Cucumber was the progenitor, came out I think mostly of the Rails community. So one of the things that I discovered a while back was that like this living documentation stuff that I'm describing, there are already products that do this, which is really neat. So here's an example where you use an example. A lot of the examples are very basic, and you'll understand why in a second. But in a case like this, it's around splitting a first and a last name. And there is a specification that gets parsed to create test fixtures, which are then run against the system under test. To give you a sense of why this was not a great idea, it's a pant load of regex, right? Which I suppose you could have ChatGPT generate for you, but just imagine how fragile this must be. I think this is a particularly egregious example. You can see why the idea of having a scenario like this, or let's place it, I think the classic example is trying to define how an ATM works and how like an overdrawn account might work, and like really define the structure around that. You can see how that would be really nice to be able to show like a business owner, like, hey, this is what's happening. This is our logic. If you need to special case something, it better be in here, and we better test it. But the little thing I'll leave you with is, the Cucumber version in Python is called Behance, or excuse me, Behave rather, as in behavior-driven testing. I just wrote out, hey, make a Python behave test for the example that we had. And I want it to be a data table, because I don't care that, you can add 2 and 2 to get 4. I almost said 5. 4. And it will actually generate both the scenario outline as well as the code in order to do that. That's a real game changer. Like, it's way, it's still fragile, but it's way less fragile than regex. And you can also play additional tricks here to try to develop a system that might be more scalable. Or, even in some cases, as I was doing with those functional tests, to be able to go in and say, well, what behavior do I actually see here based on other artifacts that I have that I can use to generate or to validate that my tests are actually testing what they ought to be testing, which is ultimately that like wonderful cyclical thing that you get into. Are my tests testing the right things? And well, what happens if my tests are testing for the wrong things and they don't catch bugs and the things because we don't know what the behavior is that was used to write the tests. And you get into this wonderful cycle of chasing one's tail, perhaps one's snake's tail. So yes, I've got a minute left, so I will use that to chop it off. But thank you guys so much for your attention, and thanks PyBay for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, so we have time for one question. If anybody wants to ask Paul a question. Right here, let's do it.
Oh dear. It just got real. Okay.
Yeah, I was just curious on how you are able to extend the tests generated by the ChatGPT and LLMs, essentially, if you have to.
To extend them in what sense?
Essentially, if you write new code, then you have to modify the existing tests, and then are they like easier to modify, or where you, yeah?
It's, I mean, I think the challenge in general with the way people conceive of LLMs is that it's good to think about like they are tools that help to reduce the amount of work that certain things take, but you still have all the implications that you would if you are changing behavior and that behavior propagates throughout your application. You have to go back and change those tests unless you have some sort of observer. And I'm using in this case, Playwright tests are effectively an instrument to observe what the behavior is. And that's, by the way, incredibly flawed to some extent, right? But yeah, you can propagate out these sorts of problems where you can definitely miss them. That all being said, writing your next incremental test or set of tests becomes so much faster and less painful. People have a tendency to do it then. So that can be really good. It's a great question, right? It's not magic, and it's not, I wouldn't even say it's not even that good. So, cool.
All right, give it up for Paul, everybody.